Hi, everyone. It's Sue, and I'm going to take a few minutes to talk to you about the Roy adaptation model, or the RAM. It's an interesting model. It continues to be well used currently today, well researched, very, very popular model, although also quite an intricate model. So let's go through some of the high points to make sure that you really see it. Now, let's start with a reminder. So here's what we're going to do in the next 20 minutes or so. Going to talk just for a few minutes about, again, the basic characteristics of the totality worldview. Do you remember that within the paradigm of nursing, we have a competition right now between a simultaneity perspective or a totality perspective? The RAM falls within a totality perspective. So we're going to just review that for a second to make sure that you're really situating this theory and how it fits within that perspective. We're going to talk about the basic structures of the Roy adaptation model and really highlight that it's an example of a totality theory. There are many different ones, but this is a really well-developed model, and we're going to use this as an example of a totality theory. We're going to really talk a little bit about how the lens through which the theorist views the world reflects his or her major concepts and constructs. And then finally, we're going to talk about strengths and weaknesses, and I'm going to give you an example of an application exercise that might be helpful in sort of situating that learning. So I hope you're going to find that all helpful and interesting. Okay, so now you're going to remember, in your course, we've talked about that, that diagram that gives us the 4 levels of knowledge or theory development. So at the very top, the most abstract level is the meta paradigm. And the meta paradigm of nursing has been identified to have 4 central concepts. And do you remember what those were? So the 4 central concepts at the highest level of abstraction are nursing, person, environment, and health. And all of the grand theories will define those 4 meta paradigm concepts: nursing, person, environment, and health. The next level down is the paradigm, right? So the second level of abstraction, so it's a little bit more concrete than the highest level of all knowledge, and that refers to the paradigm. And again, we have that idea of totality paradigm or a simultaneity paradigm. And this is an example of a totality paradigm theory. And I'm going to talk about that more in just a second. The third level down is actually where we begin to have specific constructs. And here we have a grand theory. So the third level down was grand theories or conceptual models. And remember, I said I'm not going to ask you to differentiate between the two. And then the most concrete level of theory development, the bottom of that diagram, is middle range or practice level theories. And again, it doesn't matter to me that you can differentiate between those two. So the third level down, grand theories, is where we're at today, and we've got a grand theory that falls under the totality paradigm. And so it's really important to recognize again, so grand theories are conceptual models, or they're frameworks. They're more abstract than those middle range theories, but they're less abstract than those bigger categories of knowledge, our meta paradigm or our paradigm. They often then describe concepts and their relationship to each other, or how those concepts work in and how they align with each other. And typically, this kind of theory, a grand theory, it can be applied to many different kinds of settings. So not just the care of one kind of patient, or not just, for example, inpatient, acute care versus community care, things like that. They should be applicable, a grand theory should be applicable across a range of settings. And again, just a reminder, we're looking at a grand theory within that totality worldview. And totality paradigm has a couple of really central philosophical assertions. First, that human beings are integrated. So we're made up of parts. And do you remember the comparison was the car? And we have biological, psychological, sociocultural, and spiritual dimensions. That human beings adapt to their environment. We respond to our environment. That our environment influences us. That health and illness are states on a continuum. So there's a range between health and illness. And that we're made up of interrelated, identifiable components. So they would still say within totality, the theorists would still say they have a holistic perspective, but within that holism, when we look at all of the parts as they're related, we can separate out the parts. And you remember when we get to simultaneity, that's really differentiated because within a simultaneity perspective, the belief is that we are indivisible. We cannot talk about one part without another. And the comparison for simultaneity is the cake, right? So when I put all of those ingredients together, the eggs, the flour, the sugar, the butter, I put all of that together and I bake it. And then I slice that cake. I can't look at all the separate parts and talk about them. I can't say, oh, there's the butter, there's the flour. They have become, excuse me, more than and different from the sum of their parts. The cake and a bowl of all of those ingredients are not the same thing. You are more than and different than the sum of your parts. And so you cannot break that person up and talk about those parts separately. So today we're talking about totality, where you can look at the different components, the different parts of a person, and you can bring those parts together to see how the whole acts. Here's Sister Callista Roy, and it's really important to recognize, so all of these theorists, or many of these grand theorists, are aging, and many have passed away, because a lot of this theory development happened in the 1980s. There was a huge impetus towards theory development, formal theory development in the 1980s. So while her theory has its genesis close to 40 years ago, it remains one of the most researched and most utilized theories in the world. More research is done on the Roy adaptation model than any other nursing theory. So it's important to keep that in mind, and also that it's one of the most commonly used theoretical models in terms of nursing educational programs. So many baccalaureate nursing educational programs, particularly in the United States, use this model. And at Ryerson, the nursing program has a very strong influence with the Roy adaptation model. Additionally, not the Roy model per se, but her central concepts around adaptation are threaded through the NCLEX. So understanding adaptation and how adaptation is a key conceptual idea in nursing is really helpful and important for all of us. So here's what I want you to walk away really knowing without even thinking. When you think Roy, you think adaptation and you think coping. Adaptation and coping, that's what she focuses on. So again, so Roy's background, she is actually, she's a nun and a neurosurgical nurse. And so her interest in neurosurgery and neurosciences really infiltrates her view of the theory, although over time it has evolved and become much broader. But her understanding of the ideas central to how a human being processes information and responds to information can be seen both in her definitions and in her broader model. So here's her basic meta-paradigm definitions. Nursing is, and it's quite intuitively sound, a healthcare profession that focuses on human life processes. Well, that makes sense. Don't we focus on the processes essential for supporting human life and our patterns, and emphasizes the promotion of health for individuals, families, groups, and society as a whole. So not only do we look after individuals, but we look after families, groups, and communities, and most broadly, society. So a very intuitively sound definition, something that I think most of the public would have a sense that that's appropriate, and that's what they imagine nursing does. It's not too small, but it's also not too large or abstract. In terms of defining the environment, she says the environment serves as an input that any one person has an adaptive system. So our environment is both external to us and our internal environment. But within her system, within her model, we'll talk about it as a systems model. She talks about input, throughput, and output. And the environment acts as an input. That stimuli from the environment, whether it's external to ourselves or internal stimuli, impact the person or the family or group in such a way that we are called upon to use some adaptive mechanisms to respond, and that becomes sort of our throughput and our output. So negative or positive stimuli all stem from the environment. So it can be something very positive or it can be something very negative. Regardless, it is necessary that we respond to them. And there's three kinds of stimuli that she identifies. One is focal stimuli or blatant. Those are the obvious stimuli. That's what we think we are responding to. And so that might be I go to reach for something on the stove and I realize the pot is too hot to touch, and I can feel that heat before my hand touches it. That's an external focal stimuli, the heat from the pot. But there's also contextual stimuli. And in contextual stimuli, it's not just the situation itself, but what else is going on around. So for example, let's say, again, I'm reaching for that pot, and it's a little bit hot, but maybe not too hot to touch, but in beyond that, the actual potential for a burn to my hand, I'm also thinking I'm in the middle of something, the phone is ringing and other things are happening, and that the intensity of that experience may be heightened. So in the context of that situation, what's happening that makes me process the stimuli in a different way. And then finally, there's residual stimuli. So there may even be things I don't know about. Let's say last year I burnt myself quite badly and I'm quite phobic about burning myself again, something like that. So there may even be things that I, as the person experiencing the situation, am not aware of. So the three kinds of stimulation or stimuli in the environment are the focal stimuli, so those are the obvious ones. That's what you think you are responding to. The contextual stimuli, and that sort of is the subconscious, what else is going on. And then the residual stimuli, which is not even really typically known to us. It's all of the other things that have contributed to how we're processing. Three levels, three kinds of stimuli. Back to, again, her meta-paradigm definitions. She talks about person as holistic. Now remember, there's a dispute in the totality versus simultaneity paradigms about what holistic means. In her view of holistic, that is, you're holistic because we can look at all the various components, but they are interrelated, they work together. And for her, it's really important to recognize, remember we said the two words you think of with Roy, adaptation and coping, that she sees people as adaptive systems. And again, systems theory was central to her development of this model. Systems theory is really a theory, and I'll show you her model, that really talks about what goes into the system or the situation, how is that processed, so what is the input, what is the throughput, so what kinds of things or mediators act on that, and then what is the output, what are the outcomes. And that's how essentially a systems theory. And within this model, her focus is on how are we adaptive systems. So how are we systems that use this input, throughput, output model to adapt to whatever we're experiencing. She says we have many parts with internal processes acting to maintain that adaptation, and she identifies 4 modes, and we'll talk about those 4 modes for adaptation. And then she defines health as supported by adaptive responses, and that it's defined as a state and a process of being and becoming integrated and whole. So health is not the absence of disease. Health is supported, and again, we get to define health ourselves, but health is supported through adaptation. Adaptation is central for health, and it's a state and a process of being and becoming integrated and whole within ourselves. Okay, core concepts. Remember I mentioned these as soon as we saw that first picture. Coping. So for her, coping processes are essential because they enable us to maintain our adaptation and to promote personal and environmental transformations. And so coping is a mechanism by which, as we adapt to a circumstance, we are able to maintain the change that's necessary in order to promote health and human growth. In terms of adaptation, she says that this is a process and an outcome by which thinking and feeling are used in our own conscious awareness. So we think and feel in our conscious awareness, and it's a choice to create human and environmental integration. So adaptation is a choice. Human adaptation is a choice. So Roy would see that adaptation happens through in every form of life, from the simplest microbe that responds to different kinds of environments, a toxin in an environment, whether a microbe can reproduce itself in the context of fever or in the context of an introduction of an antibiotic, versus how human beings adapt to a changing physical environment around us, things like that. So adaptation occurs across a range of human life forms, or of all life forms, not just human life forms. But humans have a much higher level of conscious adaptation. So not only are we responding to our environment, but we are processing through many adaptive modes what we are experiencing, and through our coping mechanisms, creating outcomes that are desirable for us, that the best possible outcomes. Okay, so here is the RAM. And sometimes when you look at these models, it's really easy just to kind of feel overwhelmed. But we're going to talk about this. I'm going to come back to this model several times. So we'll come back to it a couple of times. But just to get that sense of what this looks like. Remember, it's input, throughput, output. So the input is those environmental stimuli. And remember I told you there's 3 kinds of environmental stimuli. The focal stimuli, which is the obvious thing, the thing you think you are responding to. The car in front of you stops suddenly. The contextual stimuli, so what else is happening around this? And you may be responding to the car stopping in front of you, but in the same moment, your phone is ringing or something else is happening. So there's other stimuli that are may not even be completely aware of. And then residual stimuli you for sure don't even know of. You don't know that they're happening, but that's something that lingers with you. Perhaps you've experienced a car accident before. Perhaps you have an anxiety disorder that makes driving under the best of conditions difficult. Other kinds of things that you may not have necessarily been processing in the moment is related to your response to the situation, but it's part of the scenario. So environmental stimuli are the input, and again, those can be 3 levels: focal, contextual, or residual. And our job is to manage those stimuli, right? To process them and to manage them in an effective way. The throughput it occurs through the use of these coping processes. And so the coping processes are divided into 2 basic subsystems. So for an individual, it's the use of the regulator-cognator subsystem, and we'll talk about that in a second. And for a group, family, or community, it's called the stabilizer-innovator subsystem, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, because of, again, these environmental stimuli we experience, and then our use of coping mechanisms, we adapt. And we adapt through one of 4 types of modes of adaptation. So we could adapt in a physiological way for an individual, or a physical way for a family or group. And our adaptation could happen in terms of our own self-concept, or if we're talking about a group or a family, the group identity. Adaptation could happen in terms of role function, either as an individual or the role of a group or a family or community. And adaptation can happen in relation to interdependence, again, whether you're an individual or a family, group, or community. And I'm going to talk about those again just a little bit more. Okay, so let's talk about the regulator-cognator and the stabilizer-innovator coping subsystems. Do you remember that's in the middle of that diagram, and those represent the throughput, right? So we experience these stimuli, either focal as well as contextual and potentially residual. And in the face of these stimuli that we're experiencing, there is activation of one subsystem of coping. And if you're an individual, a single person, then it's your regulator-cognator system that is activated to support coping. If you're a family, group, or community, then it's the stabilizer-innovator subsystem that's activated. So let's talk first about regulator-cognator. So the regulator subsystem uses physiological processes, and that's things like chemical, neurological, and endocrine responses, and that helps the human body, right, to cope with changing environments. So, for example, you're crossing the street, you see a car careening out of control, and your body responds with a surge of adrenaline to help you to move really fast, right? And so it's really important to recognize that the regulator is involved, and think about this, in regulating the human body, right? So the regulator impacts our respiratory rate, our heart rate, our immune system, our internal temperature, all kinds of things. So physiological responses. The cognator, but not every type of coping involves our physical body, right? So the cognator involves cognition or thinking, right? And it's also those emotional processes that interact with the environment. So think about it, the cognator processes our fear in that experience, right? of almost being hit by a car. And we process those experiences to learn from them and to develop new plans for the future, such as, for example, only crossing at the crosswalk. So in that situation, both the regulator and the cognator are involved in helping us to cope. So the regulator is involved in that, in those automatic physiological responses. And so we don't have to tell our heart rate to go up. We don't have to tell our breathing to go up. We don't have to tell our body to provide a shot of adrenaline. That all happens automatically through our autonomic nervous system. The cognator is the thinking process. And the thinking process where we're much more acutely aware of that. And the cognator allows us to process the experience and to elicit coping responses or coping decisions based on that. So now let's think about stabilizer and innovator. So whereas regulator and cognator are the systems that are used by an individual, when we're talking about a group, a group doesn't share a common physiological. Everybody in the group, if you change the heart rate of one person, everybody's heart rate doesn't change, right? We don't share a common physiological environment, but we share a common physical environment, right? And we also have, instead of the cognator, so again, we don't share one common mind if I'm in a family or a group. So we wouldn't say that the thinking process would be the same, but instead for a group, what we look at is the stabilizer system and the innovator system. So stabilizer is to keep things stable and the innovator is to bring about change. So this refers to the mechanisms in particular, again, that are working within a group. The stabilizer has structures, values, and daily activities that help us to accomplish our primary purpose, whatever the purpose of the group is. And so typically, for example, we hope that a family is structured in a way that amongst the members, they're able to earn a living, provide nurturance, and educate their children, things like that, right? So the stabilizer enables the family to work collectively towards those common goals. And so what we want to think about that system, it's involved in maintaining the stability of the group. So does that make sense? As much as the regulator for an individual maintains the environment, the physiological environment, the stabilizer maintains the stability of a group. And then we look at the subsystem of the innovator, and that really refers to processes to respond to the environment with innovation or change, right? And so think about things like when a group or a family is involved in planning or bringing about, let's say it's a work situation, bringing about organizational change or thinking of strategic planning, setting new goals. So the innovator group, the innovator subsystem, helps to bring about desired changes for any kind of group. Okay, back to the RAM. Remember, we've gone through the environmental stimuli. They can be focal, so the obvious one, the blatant one, or contextual. It's in the backdrop and you're not aware of it, or even residual. It's just deeply buried and you have no idea what it is. Whatever those stimuli, whatever stimuli are involved, they elicit a response through coping processes. And remember, for an individual, those coping processes happen through the use of the regulator-cognator subsystem. And remember, regulator regulates the environment, the internal environment, and the cognator is the thinking process. For a group or a family or a community, we look at the stabilizer innovator subsystem. And remember, stabilizer helps to stabilize the group or maintain function, whereas innovator is a subsystem that supports you in making change. And when we have these environmental stimuli, then we elicit these coping processes. And the result of this is that we adapt using one or more of 4 types of adaptive modes. So these are modes of adaptation. And I'm going to take just a minute to talk about them and what they mean. So again, for the first 2, there are slightly different terms for whether we're referring to an individual or a group, family, or community. So for an individual, the first type of adaptive mode is physiological. And for a group or a family or a community, we talk about physical. Again, we don't share the same body, so it's not all the same physiological response, but it may be the same physical response. For an individual, the second adaptive mode is an adaptation around self-concept. And because a self-concept is individual as opposed to a shared self-concept for a group or a family community, the second adaptive mode is group identity. But the third adaptive mode, same title for both an individual or a family or group, is role function. So what is the role function that you play within your own life and within the context of your roles within a group? And then interdependence, not independence, but interdependence. Your ability to work with others and to be in relationship with others. And so let me just give you, again, a little bit more detail about these adaptive modes. And so again, so let's talk about physiological and the physical mode. And so that's put into play by those basic human instincts and our bodily responses, and that's necessary for survival. So physiological adaptation is necessary for human survival. I go to reach for something hot and I pull my hand back. Physiological adaptation that teaches me not to do that. There's a decrease in oxygenation in the area that I'm in, and my respiratory rate increases. So these elements, such as oxygenation, nutrition, elimination, activity, rest, and protection, those are all parts of that physiological or physical mode. The self-concept mode refers to what an individual believes or feels about who she is. So what you believe or feel about who you are physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And when we talk about group identity, you expand that to understand what is the sense of your group? What do you believe about the group and the identity of that group? And if you remember at the beginning of the course, one of the questions we asked is, who are we and how do we want to be known? That would be an activity that begins to define and elucidate or draw attention to what is our group identity. Role function describes how a person views his or her place in society. So who am I in the world and what role do I play? And it also is responsible for how a person interacts with other people. And then finally, interdependence involves a person's view about their relationships, whether you give and receive love, respect, and value. And it is powerfully impacted by significant others and your spiritual relationships. And it's through a combination of these adaptive modes that a person reacts to the stimuli that they're experiencing and either adapts to their new life situation or fails to do so. And it's really important to recognize that sometimes all modes are involved in a situation, and at other times, it maybe one mode is of primary significance and the others are much less important. And so think of this example. A student nurse is placed on a medical surgical floor, and she's assigned a 20-year-old patient who has recently been diagnosed with leukemia. How can we use the RAM model to assess and support her through this treatment? So first, we would begin with an assessment of the physiological mode. And if you think about the situation, so the stimuli would be the diagnosis of leukemia and hospitalization on that medical surgical unit. The adaptation for an individual happens through the regulator cognator subsystem. And the adaptive modes that are really significant here, let's look at physiological. So that consists of how the disease might be spreading through the body. And common side effects of cancer treatment might be really relevant here. So nausea, vomiting, weakness, fatigue, pain. And in our practice, it's really important that we determine if we're providing interventions to support the client along those. Then we would evaluate the self-concept mode. Remember, it's an individual. If it was a group, we'd look at group identity, but we're talking about a situation that's about an individual. So we look at the self-concept mode. And the self-concept mode, remember, consists of how the patient feels about herself and how her self-concept has changed. And so it considers her self-esteem, her integrity, and her spirit. And so as nurses, it's important to be aware of how our patients feel about themselves and understanding her priorities and having awareness of adaptive changes that might need to be made to improve your self-concept and self-esteem. So it's important that we ask questions to develop an understanding of the relationship that can include things like, what has made you feel better about yourself through your treatment? For example, what kind of activities or what have you done? And how has that made you feel? We'd look at role function and evaluate that role function mode. And with younger adults, Peer approval is really important. So at age 20, peer approval is going to be important. Social integrity may be important at this time. Being and appearing normal may be important. And coping mechanisms may vary again here depending on the individual. So social groups may be a really important part of this. And then finally, we evaluate the interdependence mode and look at sort of relationships and communication with others as being really important, and a strong support system that's key to adaptation. Okay, so again, I'm going to bring us back to this and to see how we've made our way through the whole model. So the environmental stimuli could be focal, so blatant, the thing that we think we're responding to, the obvious thing. Contextual, so what's in the environment around this. And then residual, which is something so deeply hidden we're not even aware of it. Because of this stimuli that we experience, coping processes are initiated, and for an individual that happens through the use of the regulator and cognator subsystem. So the regulator, remember, is physiological processes. You don't have to take part in them yourself. The cognator system, on the other hand, is the thinking and feeling part of that. If we're talking about a group, the subsystems that are involved include the stabilizer and innovator subsystem, and in that, stabilizer helps the group to remain stable. Innovator allows the group to effect change. And through the activation of those coping processes, 4 different modes of adaptation are possible. And any individual or group can have 1 mode of adaptation, can have 2, can have 3, or all 4 may be involved in a situation. So for an individual, the modes of adaptation were physiological, self-concept, role function, and interdependence. For a family, group, or community, the modes of adaptation were physical, remember, physiological for an individual, physical for a group. Group identity, and again, I'm going to say, remember, for an individual, it was self-concept, but for a group or family or community, it was group identity. And the last were the same, role function and interdependence. And through that process of input, stimuli is input, coping process being activated is your throughput, and your adaptation through those modes of adaptation is your output. We have that systemic response, and that those 2 main concepts, coping and adaptation. Here's just a light example. I'll let you take your time, but click on it. It's just a fun example, fun for me as a nursing theory teacher, that really shows how that coping and adaptation are really essential. And then a nice link to give you a few minutes to really hear Sister Callista Roy talk about her theory and its development and her life. Okay, so let's talk about this theory just for a second. What works? This theory is well defined. So this systems approach is very explicit, it's very clear, the relationships between those concepts are very clear, and you see how it makes sense intuitively, but also in terms of how you can use this to guide practice. And we use that example of a young woman who's experiencing a new onset of cancer diagnosis and the care that she requires. And it makes sense for many people out in the world that we are required to use some coping mechanisms in order to adapt to whatever we're experiencing. So it can be used in practice, and it is intuitively sensible. It also works within typical, healthcare structures, right? It also addresses holistic needs of patients because we look at all different levels of coping and all different levels of adaptation. And we can use it in many settings. It's generalizable to many settings. So what doesn't work? Some people really suggest that their scope is limited because it primarily addresses that concept of adaptation to the environment. So there's that person-environment interaction is at the center, so we don't necessarily explore as much around other kinds of concepts. And it's funny because Sister Callista Roy was a nun, and so this criticism she found always a little bit ironic, but it doesn't really explicitly talk about a spiritual or humanistic or those existential aspects of being a human being. And for Roy, she said because spirituality is so deeply embedded in everything that she did and who she was, it wasn't necessary to be as explicit as her critics might have wanted. But for some of the critics of this theory, that's one area they would have liked to see more developed. But I'm just going to give you a scenario, and this gives you a little bit of a sense of how you could apply the theory. So imagine we're living in a world where there's been a worldwide infectious respiratory pandemic, so pan flu, spread to all kinds of communities, including the region in which you guys practice. And all available health personnel, including nursing students, are required to work up to their own level of knowledge, skill, and judgment to provide care. And so nursing students have been designed, just like you, to work in small groups, doing home visits with patients and families who are quarantined due to their exposure to the virus. And you in a small group are asked to be responsible for seeing the Tam family. So here's what we know. Mr. Alan Tam is a 38-year-old gentleman who works as an accountant, and he and his wife moved here from Hong Kong 18 years ago. Mrs. Ming Tam is 35. She's the primary caregiver for Justin, who's extremely attached to his mom, and she's also a dental hygiene student. The Tam family have 3 children. Emily is 15 years old, and she attends high school. Jason is 11 years old and attends grade school, and he has a history of severe asthma and allergies to many foods and environmental products. And then Justin is a 2-year-old who doesn't yet attend school and is showing signs of autism. So what would you do with all that information? Well, it would be important to recognize that using the RAM model as your guide, you could undertake an assessment of this family. How would you do that? Do you remember you're looking for the stimuli? So what are the focal, the contextual, and the residual stimuli? And then what kind of coping mechanisms or coping processes, regulator, cognitive for individuals, and when we're talking about them working together as a family or as a group, the stabilizer innovator subsystem, and then finally, what kinds of adaptation are happening and can be supported to happen, both on an individual level with the 4 modes of adaptation or as a family, again, on those 4 modes of adaptation. So we would look at the potential stressors and the stimuli in the situation. We would consider what information is needed that's not available to us using the medical model. A lot of that information that you received is based specifically in the medical model. We would look at how, again, so identify those stimuli and then look at how the regulator, cognator, coping processes can be applied to individuals, and then look at how the stabilizer, innovator coping processes can be applied to the family. And then we would really summarize all of this information and then talk about how we would be able to support adaptation for members of the family through those 4 modes, and then for the family altogether through those 4 modes. Gosh, I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. I know it's a lot to take in, and sometimes it gets really tedious. So I hope this is helpful for you in beginning exploration of Roy. It would take a long, long, long time, I think, to come to a full appreciation. But important to recognize this is a very elegant theory, well-developed, well-researched, one of the most researched theories that you can find in the world now. If you were to do a literature search, you would find more research using the Roy adaptation model than any other nursing theory. So it continues to be well used in practice, particularly internationally, and is well received across a huge range of communities, scientific communities and practice communities. So on we go to continue to study nursing conceptual models, but I hope this has been of interest, and I look forward to more lectures. See you all soon.